and empathy. Now, one of the big things about empathy and the problems associated with autism is that empathy, by definition, involves perspective taking. In order to empathise, you have to get into someone else's shoes. You have to see things from their perspective. You have to imagine what it's like for them. And I really, really struggle with social imagination. I know I struggle with it because, well, it's pretty obvious in many ways. Well, when I was a child, I just could not understand plot, like, you know, in fiction and things like that. I couldn't understand the characters' motivations. I couldn't empathise with the characters. I struggle with that even now. My comprehension has improved a lot, by the way. And when I was a kid, that was one of the things they were concerned about, was the fact I wasn't actually reading for meaning. Basically, I didn't understand what I was reading, and I had to do exercises where I had to put pictures in order. I remember being taken out of lessons to do that. And yeah, and I would often, it was like a kid was having a birthday party. What picture goes next? Like, you had to put the picture in a sequence, you know, to basically, it's like a story, and I, no idea, put them completely wrong order. Because, yeah, following plots and sequences and putting meaning together like that has always been really difficult for me. Obviously, I'm a lot better at reading comprehension now, but people often will say they read fiction and they empathise with the characters and it makes them upset what's going on and they really relate to characters. I can't do that, and I've got no idea. When people say that, it's like a completely different language to me. Like, I do read some fiction, although I do generally prefer fact. I find fact easier to read, but I do read fiction as long as it's something I'm interested in, and I can enjoy some fiction, but I always have to use Spark Notes to help me understand it, because otherwise I get really confused still with the plot and everything, unless I use notes. If I use notes, it's fine, but I have to use notes because otherwise I have no idea what's going on in the plot, or I get really confused. But yeah, I don't read for empathy. When I'm reading a book, I never cry when I'm reading. Because even if it's a tale where you're supposed to be upset, I empathise in that way. But if I'm watching a film, I can cry. But it might be that in a film, it's easier for you to empathise, because if you think about it, when you're reading fiction, like, you have to do all the work for yourself, and my brain can't imagine that well. Like, it's more intellectual. Like, I think most people's brains when they're reading fiction is like imagining stuff, and I can't imagine in that way. But and I can't form any real, like, pictures about what's going on, like, so I'm not really developing a deep emotional connection with the characters. When people talk about developing an emotional connection with characters, fiction, it's just a completely different world. I can't understand it. I read fiction for intellectual purposes, not because I like some fiction, but I read it as part of a challenge, like something intellectual. I can't, like, emotionally read, like what some people do. But if I'm watching a film, like I did cry when I watched Titanic. I used to watch Titanic on repeat because I was very interested in the Titanic film, and I did used to cry or find it sad. And also when I saw the Boy in the Striped Pyjamas film, that was very moving and also made me upset. And also when I watched Anne Frank's diary as a teenager, I remember that made me really upset. But I think it wouldn't have made me upset in the same way if I was reading it as a book, because I didn't get upset when I read the book. But when I saw the film, that made me upset. But I think it's a combination of music, you know, like seeing what was happening. Because in a film, you've got less to imagine. It's all basically shown, so that would made it easier for me to empathise, or at least my effective empathy, you know, could come out. Like I said, I don't think I completely lack effective empathy, clearly, because otherwise I wouldn't find it upsetting. So obviously I do have effective empathy. It's just, I think that, like, reading, it's a lot harder for that empathy for me to come out because I struggle with the imagination side of things. So it's like it has to be really concrete for the empathy to come out. I think that's it. It has to be very concrete for me to empathise. I think I've just hit the nail on the head. Basically, it has to be concrete. And I think that's why I find it easier to empathise when I can see what's going on. If someone's just telling me something, I can't imagine it, because I'm not in that situation. I'm not experiencing it. I can't imagine what I haven't experienced. Literally, I can't imagine it. It's like my brain is blocked. I can't imagine it. But if it's something that's like really concrete, which is why if I were to see someone actually suffering, I'd be really upset, just like any person would, because it's obvious and it's concrete. But if someone's like emotionally upset or anything like that and there's no context behind it, I cannot relate to it. Anne Frank's diary made me upset because it was so awful what was happening to them, and like the fact they were dying and stuff and suffering in a real physical way that I could understand and see is why it made me upset. And the same in Titanic, because people were dying, and that made me upset because I don't like people to die. So, and because I could see it, but if I'd read it in a book, it wouldn't have made me upset. Because yeah, like if you were to read a book and it had and it was just telling you that people are dying, I'd have to imagine it, and my imagination then I can't bring a picture into my head, like I can't imagine it properly, so it doesn't trigger the empathy. If you're autistic, by the way, and you have a similar issue, and whether or not films make you more empathetic or not, but you struggle more with reading and get the empathy into the reading, let me know, because that'd be quite an interesting thing to find out if other people have this kind of thing. Yeah, this is such a long topic, and I'm going to have to do quite a few videos on this, as I don't think I'm going to be able to fit it all into videos today, because I do want to talk a bit about examples from the past when I displayed an extreme lack of empathy, and some experiences which I am not, which I have a guilty conscience about. I mean, I'm sure like all children do things that aren't so nice, and then they grow up and you mature and stuff. And obviously I'm a different person now, so I know you can't really beat yourself up about things that you did when you were younger, because you're a different person and you grow and develop and stuff. But yeah, like I did do some very immature, like inappropriate things when I was like a child. But looking back, which I do want to talk about in another video, because I think although like part of me doesn't want to talk about them because I sort of feel that like people might judge me, even though it's a long time ago. I sort of feel like it's important, and also like, and I will talk about this in another video because there is time now, but like looking back on it, I think basically the issue was that I literally, again, it was a lack of social imagination, and I literally had no idea what was going on for the other person, and now, because my social imagination has developed, like I now know, and I've got enough theory of mind now, which I didn't have when I was a kid, to know that to know the effects of doing things like that, and like, yeah, so I've changed basically, and I do feel that I sort of think that's the issue with autism. Often, if we can't imagine something, we can't empathise. But once we can imagine it, or once it's explained to us, and we're like, oh yeah, that makes sense, then sometimes that empathy can then be turned on. It's like a light bulb. It's like when I'm reading a fiction, empathy not there because I can't imagine. When I see the film and it's more concrete, like in Anne Frank's diary, the empathy came out because I could then see it, what was going on. That brought out that empathy, which maybe is latent, but it just takes a lot more for it to come out because of the problems with imagination. And obviously, that's the cognitive side. You have to imagine it, your theory of mind. I can't get into someone else's shoes. I don't know, when I was a kid I literally had no idea even about feelings. Like I literally couldn't, basically had no concept of them, which I do now as an adult, but it's very intellectual. But I do have a concept of it now, it's just quite an intellectual awareness. But yeah, once that imagination has been made more explicit, even if it's through a very intellectual route, I think the effective empathy can then be switched on, but you have to be able to imagine it for that to happen. So the empathy is there in autism, I think, but I think it's latent. In other words, the autistic person does care, it's just that you can't care, it's just that caring, in order